Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. It began with a note, short, sharp, and chilling. It was tucked under my windshield wiper, scrawled in jagged handwriting on the back of a torn receipt. You can't run forever. At first I thought it was a mistake, a random act of intimidation directed at the wrong car. The lot where I worked wasn't the safest, and it wasn't unusual to hear about petty crimes or strange encounters. Still, the words left me uneasy. I scanned the parking lot, my heart pounding, but the space was empty, save for a few scattered vehicles. The unease stayed with me for the rest of the day. I told myself it was probably a prank, some bored teenager with a twisted sense of humor. By the time I got home, I had almost convinced myself it wasn't worth worrying about. But as I unlocked my door, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, sleep came in fits, interrupted by faint noises outside, a car door slamming, footsteps on the pavement. Each time I jolted awake, I found nothing out of place. Still, the sense of unease lingered. The second incident was impossible to dismiss. A week after finding the note, I was stopped on my way to work by a man I didn't recognize. He was tall and wiry, his face shadowed by a baseball cap. As I stepped out of my car, he crossed the lot with purpose, blocking my path. "You think you can just disappear?" he spat, his voice low but brimming with anger. I froze, my mind racing. "I don't know who you think I am, but—" "Don't play dumb," he interrupted, stepping closer. His eyes narrowed, scanning my face as though searching for a crack in my facade. "We know what you did." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving me shaken. I watched him go, too stunned to call out. My breath came in shallow gasps as I hurried into the building, my pulse racing. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Every time the office phone rang, I jumped. I scanned the windows, half expecting to see the man again. That evening, I left work through the back door, taking a longer route home. When I finally got there, I found another note taped to my front door. "We'll find you." The following morning, I decided to piece together what was happening. If someone thought I had wronged them, I needed to understand why. The notes and the confrontation weren't random. They had to be based on something. I started with the obvious, my name. A quick online search revealed several people with the same first and last name as me, but one entry stood out. A local man who had been arrested 2 years ago for fraud and theft. The mugshot looked nothing like me, but the resemblance was enough that I could see how someone might mistake us from a distance. Digging deeper, I found articles detailing his scams and the damage he had caused. He had swindled dozens of people out of thousands of dollars, targeting small business owners and vulnerable individuals. My stomach churned as I read the accounts, imagining the anger and desperation of his victims. It wasn't hard to see how someone could mistake me for him, especially if they only had vague information to go on. But knowing the truth didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, it made the situation worse. Whoever was after me wouldn't believe it was a simple case of mistaken identity. Not when they were convinced I had ruined their lives. I tried to stay cautious, but the threats kept coming. Another note appeared on my car, this one even more menacing. "Time's up." Then one night, I came home to find my apartment door ajar. My heart dropped as I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. The space was eerily silent, but it was clear someone had been there. Drawers were left open, their contents scattered. A chair had been tipped over, and a framed photo of my family lay shattered on the floor. The message was clear. Whoever had been there hadn't taken anything. They had come to send a warning. I called the police, my hands trembling as I described the break-in. An officer arrived within the hour, his demeanor professional but unconcerned. "Without any witnesses or evidence, there's not much we can do," he said, his tone flat. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain the threats without sounding paranoid. "I think someone has mistaken me for someone else," I said finally. "But they're serious. They think I've done something terrible." The officer nodded but offered little reassurance. "We'll file a report and keep an eye on the area. Let us know if you see or hear anything else." As he left, I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me. The police couldn't protect me from people who believed they had nothing to lose. I knew I couldn't stay here, not when every shadow, every creak in the night felt like a prelude to something worse. It was time to leave. Leaving wasn't easy. The thought of abandoning the life I had built filled me with dread, but the escalating threats left me with no choice. The break-in had stripped me of any illusion of safety, and the notes and confrontations were no longer just warnings, they were promises. I started by taking precautions, leaving as little trace as possible. I changed my routines, withdrew cash in small increments, and avoided using my credit cards. Each action felt like a step deeper into the unknown, but it was necessary. I stayed with a friend for a few nights, too paranoid to return to my apartment. It wasn't long before my fears were validated. One evening, while parked in an unfamiliar lot, I spotted the same man from the confrontation outside my workplace. He was leaning against a lamppost, pretending to scroll through his phone, but his gaze darted up every few seconds, scanning the area. When our eyes met, he straightened, pocketing his phone and starting toward me. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I started my car and sped out of the lot, my heart pounding as I watched him grow smaller in my rearview mirror. By the time I reached my friend's house, I was shaking. "They know where I am," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't stay here. I have to leave, for good." I spent the next few days preparing to disappear. It was like dismantling my own life piece by piece. I resigned from my job via email, leaving no forwarding address. I packed only the essentials, leaving behind anything that could tie me to my past. Friends and family reached out, confused and concerned, but I offered only vague excuses, a sudden opportunity, a need for change. When the time came to leave, I chose a route that avoided major highways and cities, opting for back roads that would keep me off the radar. Each mile I put between myself and my old life felt like shedding a layer of fear, though the paranoia lingered. By the time I reached my destination, a modest apartment in a city several states away, I was physically and emotionally drained. The walls were bare, the rooms echoing with emptiness, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of relief. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the aggressors might find me again. What if they had tracked me through something I hadn't considered? What if they refused to let go of their vendetta, even after I had vanished? Life in the new city was quiet, almost too quiet. I avoided making connections, keeping my interactions limited to brief exchanges at the grocery store or with my landlord. Each day was a routine of necessity, work, errands, home, designed to keep me invisible. But the fear persisted. Small things would set me off. A car parked too long on my street, a stranger lingering near my building. Once I thought I saw the man from the parking lot across the street, his hood pulled low over his face. My chest tightened as I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and peeking through the blinds. The figure was gone when I looked again, but the anxiety lingered. The isolation took its toll. Without friends or family nearby, my thoughts had nowhere to go but inward. I replayed the events over and over, trying to make sense of the aggressor's actions and my own choices. Had I done enough to ensure my safety, or had I left behind loose ends that would eventually catch up with me? Months passed and the immediate threat seemed to fade. I began to settle into a routine, the paranoia slowly giving way to cautious optimism. The idea of a weekend retreat had seemed perfect. Nestled deep in the woods, the cabin offered a quiet reprieve from the chaos of daily life. The drive up was long, the winding roads narrowing until they became little more than a dirt trail. I was in the back seat, wedged between our bags as we approached the cabin. It looked just like the listing photos, rustic, with a wraparound porch and a view of the lake shimmering in the distance. The air smelled crisp, the kind of freshness you only find in the wilderness. It felt like an escape. We unloaded the car, hauling bags into the cabin and claiming bedrooms. I picked the smallest room, drawn to its window overlooking the dense forest. The others teased me about my hermit retreat, but I liked the quiet. Once we settled in, we decided to explore. The woods were vast and untouched, the trails barely marked. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. We laughed and took photos, marveling at how far removed we were from the rest of the world. The sense of isolation was thrilling. Hours passed before we made our way back. As we approached the cabin, I noticed the window in the main room was open. I distinctly remembered shutting it before we left, but I said nothing. Inside, something felt off. It was subtle. My jacket, left on a chair, was now draped over the back of the couch. A book one of the others had left on the table was now on the floor. I mentioned it casually, but no one seemed concerned. "Wind," one of them said, brushing it off. We were here to relax, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin the mood. Still, a small kernel of unease took root as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first night passed in fits and starts. I woke several times to the sound of creaking wood, but I told myself it was just the cabin settling. When morning came, the unease from the day before lingered. After breakfast, I wandered onto the porch. The air was damp from an early mist, and that's when I saw it, a single wet footprint on the wooden planks. It was faint, already drying, but unmistakable. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't stepped out barefoot, and neither had anyone else, as far as I knew. I showed the others, but they shrugged it off. "Probably an animal," someone said, though I could tell they didn't entirely believe it. There was tension in the air, unspoken but present. The day felt heavier, the woods less inviting. We stayed close to the cabin, some of us reading, others scrolling on our phones. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. At one point, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of shadow among the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. That night, the noises started. At first, it was faint, a rustle of leaves, a branch snapping. I told myself it was just wildlife, but as the hours dragged on, the sounds became more deliberate. A soft tapping on the windows, a creak on the porch. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body taut. No one else mentioned it in the morning, but I could see the unease in their eyes. The second day passed in a haze. I tried to focus on a book, but the words blurred together. The others were subdued as well. We avoided talking about the noises, as if ignoring them would make them go away. As evening fell, the atmosphere inside the cabin grew oppressive. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. While the others played cards, I stood at the window, staring out at the tree line. That's when I saw it, movement among the trees. A figure, barely visible, darting between the trunks. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to call out, to alert the others, but something stopped me. The figure moved again, closer this time, before disappearing into the shadows. When I finally turned back to the group, I said nothing. What could I say? That I thought I'd seen someone in the woods? They would just laugh it off, or worse, panic. As night fell, the noises returned, louder this time. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the creaks and thuds that seemed to come from every direction. Sleep was impossible. The second night was worse. The tapping on the windows became more insistent, almost rhythmic. I tried to ignore it, but every time I thought it stopped, it would start again. Around midnight, I heard something heavier, a dragging sound, like someone pulling a large object across the ground. I couldn't stay in my room any longer. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept into the main room. The others were already there, sitting in tense silence. They'd heard it too. We didn't speak, but the fear was palpable. At one point, I mustered the courage to look out the window. The beam of my flashlight swept across the yard, illuminating the trees. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, at the edge of the light, something moved. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing just beyond the trees. It didn't run or hide, it just stood there, watching. I dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the floor. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The rest of the night passed in agonizing silence, the noises subsiding as dawn approached. None of us spoke as we waited for the light of day. The morning brought no comfort. The pale sunlight seemed weaker, struggling to penetrate the thick fog that clung to the trees. I barely ate as we gathered in the main room. No one spoke at first, the unspoken fear hanging in the air like a storm cloud. It wasn't until someone noticed the scratches on the cabin door that the silence broke. Deep grooves marred the wood, trailing from the bottom to the middle of the door. It was as if someone, or something, had clawed at it in the night. Next to the doorframe, a small, partially eaten apple sat on the windowsill, its flesh bruised and brown. None of us had left it there. "We need to leave," someone finally said, their voice tight with panic. The words sparked a debate that quickly turned heated. Some argued that we were overreacting, that the scratches could be from an animal and the noises just our imaginations. Others, like me, were ready to pack up and leave immediately. The tension was unbearable. Every small noise, every creak of the cabin's old wooden beams set us on edge. I found myself glancing constantly at the windows, half expecting to see that shadowy figure again. By afternoon, we were no closer to a decision, but the cracks in our group were beginning to show. The final night was the longest. We'd agreed reluctantly to stay one more night, promising to leave first thing in the morning. None of us slept. The noises began earlier this time, just after sunset. The tapping on the windows was back, but louder, more insistent. The dragging sound returned, closer now, as if circling the cabin. I sat in the corner of the room, gripping a flashlight and staring at the door. Every few minutes I would hear a faint, almost imperceptible laughter. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far enough away either. The others sat in silence, too terrified to speak. Just past midnight, the thudding started. Heavy, deliberate bangs against the walls, as if someone was pounding with both fists. My breath hitched with every impact. It moved around the cabin, from one wall to the next, until it reached the door. Then it stopped. I strained to hear, every nerve in my body on high alert. The silence was worse than the noise. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was impossible to tell. Finally, just as I started to think it was over, there was a single sharp knock at the door. None of us moved. The sound of footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, fading into the distance. When the first rays of sunlight pierced the cabin windows, we were already packed and ready to go. We left in a frantic rush, throwing bags into the car and locking the cabin door behind us. The forest was eerily quiet as we loaded up, the usual chirping of birds and rustling of leaves conspicuously absent. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure lurking among the trees. The drive down the dirt road was tense, the tires kicking up clouds of dust as we sped away. My heart didn't stop racing until the cabin was out of sight. As the car wound its way back toward civilization, I felt a faint sense of relief. We were safe. It was over. Or so I thought. One of my friends, sitting in the passenger seat, suddenly stiffened. "Don't stop," they whispered, their voice trembling. I glanced in the rearview mirror and my stomach dropped. At the edge of the forest, barely visible through the haze of dust, was a figure. It stood perfectly still, watching us as we drove away. Jogging had always been my escape. The rhythm of my feet pounding the pavement and the crisp air filling my lungs offered a reprieve from the monotony of everyday life. My favorite route was through the local park, a sprawling expanse of manicured trails, thick woods, and open fields. It was familiar, safe, a place where I could let my mind wander without worry. That evening, the park seemed quieter than usual. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the trails. I had my usual route planned, but something made me hesitate as I passed a small, overgrown path I'd never noticed before. It veered off into the denser part of the park, partially obscured by branches and tall grass. Curiosity got the better of me. The main trail was predictable, and I felt an urge to explore, to shake off the routine. The narrow path wound deeper into the woods, the sounds of the park fading behind me. There were no joggers, no families with strollers, just the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. After about 10 minutes, I came to a clearing. It wasn't marked on the park's map, but it looked like it had been used recently. There were chairs arranged in a loose circle around a makeshift table, and the ground was littered with cigarette butts and empty cans. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though I hadn't seen anyone on the way here. I stood there for a moment, uneasy. Something about the setup felt wrong. It wasn't just the litter or the abandoned chairs. It was the sense that I wasn't supposed to be there, as if I'd stumbled into something private, something secret. I stepped closer to the table, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The surface was scratched and stained, as if it had been used for purposes far rougher than a picnic. A small tarp lay crumpled on the ground nearby, its edges darkened with what I hoped was dirt, but instinctively knew wasn't. Near the edge of the clearing, someone had spray-painted a crude emblem on a tree, a circle with jagged lines radiating from its center. It didn't look like graffiti left by teenagers. It felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for the first time, I considered turning back. Then I heard voices. They were faint at first, just low murmurs carried on the breeze. My stomach tightened as they grew louder, more distinct. Several people were approaching from the direction I'd come, their footsteps crunching on the path. I panicked, ducking into the underbrush and crouching low, my breath shallow as I tried to stay hidden. The group entered the clearing, a half-dozen figures, their faces obscured by the growing darkness. They spoke in hushed tones, their conversation punctuated by short, sharp bursts of laughter. I couldn't make out much, but the tension in their voices was unmistakable. I stayed as still as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. It felt like hours before one of them, a tall figure with a commanding presence, gestured toward the table. The others gathered around, their movements deliberate. I couldn't see what they were doing, but the air grew heavy with an almost palpable sense of menace. I knew I needed to leave. Whatever was happening in that clearing, I didn't want to be a part of it. Slowly, I began to inch backward, careful not to disturb the branches around me. But then, in my haste, I shifted my weight too quickly. A dry branch snapped under my foot, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. The group froze. Their heads turned toward the bushes where I was hiding, their conversation cutting off mid-sentence. My breath hitched as one of them, a stocky figure wearing a dark jacket, stepped forward, scanning the underbrush. "Did you hear that?" he said, his voice sharp and suspicious. The others murmured in agreement, spreading out to search the perimeter of the clearing. Panic surged through me. I crouched lower, willing myself to disappear as the stocky figure drew closer. He stopped just feet away, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the shadows. My heart thundered so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Probably an animal," another voice called, but it didn't sound convincing. The man lingered a moment longer before turning back to the group. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. They were still suspicious, and I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I waited until they were distracted, their attention momentarily drawn back to the table. Then I bolted, crashing through the underbrush toward the main trail. Behind me, I heard shouts, angry, alarmed. They had seen me. I ran like I'd never run before, the fear giving my legs a speed I didn't know they were capable of. The group was close behind, their shouts echoing through the trees. The branches scratched at my arms and face as I barreled through the darkened woods, my lungs burning with every breath. I didn't dare look back. All I could hear were their footsteps pounding behind me, growing louder with each second. The narrow path twisted and turned, and I prayed I wouldn't trip or lose my footing. Ahead, I spotted a maintenance shed partially hidden by overgrown bushes. Beside it was a large industrial garbage can with its lid ajar. Desperate, I darted toward it, climbing in and pulling the lid closed over me. The smell was overwhelming, rotting food and damp trash, but I didn't care. I held my breath, my body pressed against the cold metal as I listened. The group's footsteps approached, their voices urgent and angry. They fanned out, their search methodical. One of them stopped right next to the garbage can. I could hear their labored breathing, could feel the weight of their presence just inches away. "Spread out," someone said, their voice sharp. They couldn't have gotten far. The person lingered for a moment longer before moving on. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle in my body tense. I didn't dare move, didn't even allow myself to exhale fully, as they continued their search. The inside of the garbage can was suffocating. The rank smell of rotting food clung to my nostrils, and the sticky sides pressed against me. I could hear everything, the crunch of footsteps on gravel, the murmured curses of frustration as they searched the area. My body was rigid, every nerve screaming at me to move, but I stayed frozen. One of the pursuers came dangerously close. I could hear their boots scuffing the ground directly beside the can. The lid shifted slightly as they tapped the side, muttering something under their breath. My heart was pounding so hard I feared they'd hear it. The sound of their heavy breathing made my skin crawl. "Check over there," a voice called from a few yards away. The person lingered for what felt like an eternity, then finally stepped back and moved toward the clearing. Relief coursed through me, but I didn't dare move. The faint murmurs of their conversation and the crunching of their boots began to fade, but I waited. The silence was deceptive. It felt like a trap. After what could have been minutes or hours, the area grew quiet again. No footsteps, no voices, just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I counted to 100 before daring to lift the lid slightly, peeking out into the darkness. The clearing was empty. I climbed out of the garbage can, my body stiff and trembling. My clothes were smeared with filth, but I barely noticed. My eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of movement. The park was still, eerily so, as if holding its breath. Moving cautiously, I crept back toward the main trail. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches clawing at the narrow path. Every sound, an owl's call, the rustle of a squirrel, made me flinch. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. When I finally reached the main trail, the familiar sight should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The long, open stretch of pavement felt exposed, vulnerable. My instincts screamed at me to stay hidden, but I couldn't afford to linger. I broke into a jog, then a sprint, my feet pounding against the ground as I raced toward the park's entrance. The closer I got to the edge of the park, the more certain I became that I was being followed. I couldn't hear them, but I could feel their presence like a weight pressing down on me. I didn't stop until I was out of the park, the glow of the streetlights washing over me like a lifeline. Back in my apartment, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my chest heaving. My body was sore, my legs shaking from the run. The adrenaline that had kept me going was starting to wear off, replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. I tried to make sense of what had happened, but the pieces didn't fit. Who were those people? What were they doing in the clearing? And why had they chased me so relentlessly? The questions spiraled through my mind, but there were no answers, only a gnawing sense of dread. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I'd stumbled upon some shady meeting in the park? That they'd chased me but ultimately didn't catch me? Without proof, it sounded absurd. Worse, it felt dangerous. Whoever they were, they'd seen me. They'd know if I talked. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of my apartment, every shadow cast by passing headlights made my heart race. I kept imagining the group standing outside my window, watching, waiting. By morning, I'd resolved never to go back to that park. It wasn't worth the risk. I moved into the apartment with high hopes. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest one-bedroom in an older building, but it was mine, and the prospect of starting fresh in a new place felt liberating. The landlord had been kind, giving me a good deal on the rent. The building was quiet, tucked away on a tree-lined street, and most of the other tenants seemed to keep to themselves. Unpacking was tedious but satisfying. By the time evening rolled around, I was surrounded by half-empty boxes and the comforting clutter of a new home in progress. I spent my first night arranging furniture and setting up the essentials. The apartment was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards or the faint hum of the refrigerator. I chalked it up to the building's age. As I lay in bed that night, I realized just how quiet the place really was. The walls seemed thick, insulating me from the outside world. It wasn't until just past midnight that I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway. I assumed it was one of my neighbors returning late, but the sound stopped abruptly, just outside my door. I sat up, straining to listen. After a moment, the footsteps resumed, this time fading down the hallway. It wasn't until the sound disappeared completely that I allowed myself to relax. I told myself it was nothing unusual, just the quirks of a new place, and eventually drifted off to sleep. The second night, the noises started again. It began the same way, slow footsteps echoing faintly through the hallway. But this time, there were whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was hushed, urgent, as though someone was having a private conversation. The sound unnerved me, though I tried to dismiss it as late-night chatter from one of the neighboring units. When the whispers stopped, a loud thud startled me. It sounded as though something heavy had fallen just outside my apartment. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and approached the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the flickering overhead light. The following day, I decided to ask the landlord about the unit next to mine. "The one on the left?" he asked, frowning. "That's been empty for months. No one's rented it yet." I forced a smile and thanked him, but his words left me unsettled. If the unit was vacant, where were the noises coming from? That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the footsteps and whispers to return. They didn't disappoint. It was the fourth night when the knocking began. I had been dreaming, an uneasy, restless dream I couldn't quite recall, when a sharp, insistent knock pulled me into wakefulness. At first I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again. 3 loud knocks, evenly spaced, reverberated through the room. I sat up, frozen. The sound was coming from my front door. I glanced at the clock. It was just past 2 a.m. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, as though whoever was on the other side wasn't in a hurry. Summoning what little courage I had, I tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The knocking stopped as soon as I looked. I stood there for several moments, heart pounding, before I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to the vacant unit down the hall was ajar. A faint red light spilled out from the opening, casting strange, flickering shadows on the walls. I stared at the open door, unable to move. The light was unnatural, pulsating faintly, as though it had a rhythm of its own. Fear rooted me in place. Finally, I backed away, closing my own door as quietly as I could and locking it. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The following night, I tried to convince myself it had all been a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. The red glow had been real. I could still picture it vividly, spilling out into the dark hallway, its flickering shadows dancing like living things. I stayed up late, determined not to sleep until I had some answers. Midnight came and went, the silence oppressive. Just when I began to think nothing would happen, the noises returned. The footsteps were louder this time, more deliberate. They stopped in front of my door, then continued toward the vacant unit. I got up, heart pounding, and approached my peephole. The door to the unit was open again, the red glow brighter than before. Shadows moved within, but they didn't behave like ordinary shadows. They twisted and writhed as though alive, shifting across the walls in impossible patterns. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The whispers began, faint but insistent. They weren't muffled like before. They were clear, almost pleading. I couldn't make out the words, but their tone filled me with a deep, primal dread. When the glow began to intensify, spilling out into the hallway, I stumbled back from the door, panic overtaking me. I locked myself in my bedroom, pulling the covers over my head like a child hiding from a nightmare. Sleep didn't come, and the whispers stayed with me long after the noises faded. The next morning, the hallway was as it always had been, plain, dimly lit, and utterly ordinary. The door to the vacant unit was shut, as if the events of the night before had been a fever dream. But I knew it wasn't. The memory of the red glow and the whispers lingered, filling me with an unease I couldn't shake. I began avoiding the hallway altogether. If I needed to leave my apartment, I took the stairs at the other end of the building, even though it added time to my errands. Passing by that unit felt like tempting fate, and I wasn't willing to take the risk. The paranoia followed me into my own apartment. Small, inexplicable things began happening. A glass I was sure I had left in the sink was suddenly on the counter. A cupboard door I knew I'd shut was slightly ajar. At first I dismissed it as absent-mindedness, but then the occurrences grew stranger. One night, I awoke to the sound of running water. Stumbling into the bathroom, I found the faucet fully turned on. I hadn't used the sink before bed. My chest tightened as I turned it off, staring at the still dripping spout. I tried to convince myself that the old plumbing was to blame, but deep down, I knew better. The noises from the vacant unit persisted, growing louder with each passing night. The footsteps were no longer confined to the hallway. They seemed to echo through the walls of my own apartment. And the whispers, they had started to sound closer. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the uncertainty, it gnawed at me, demanding answers. I resolved to investigate the vacant unit during the day when the oppressive atmosphere seemed less threatening. Around noon, I stood outside the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway was silent, the flickering light above casting uneven shadows. I reached out and turned the doorknob, expecting it to be locked. To my relief, or perhaps my terror, it didn't budge. The unit was sealed as it should be, the deadbolt firmly in place. But as I stood there, staring at the unyielding door, I heard it, a faint knock, coming from inside the unit. The sound was soft, almost polite, but it sent ice through my veins. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, and fled to my apartment. I locked the door behind me, trembling. That night, the knocking returned, louder this time. It wasn't at my door. It was coming from inside the walls, echoing through the building. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to seep into my very bones. The seventh night was the worst. The knocking started earlier, relentless and insistent. I stayed in my bedroom, too terrified to answer, but it didn't stop. The walls seemed to vibrate with the force of it, the sound reverberating through the apartment like a drumbeat. Then, suddenly, it stopped. I waited, my breath shallow, straining to hear what came next. That's when I heard the creak of a door opening. Not mine, the door to the vacant unit. My heart raced as I crept toward my own door, peeking through the peephole. The hallway was bathed in that familiar red glow. The door to the vacant unit was wide open, the shadows inside spilling out like smoke. They didn't behave like normal shadows. They crawled along the walls, stretching unnaturally, pooling around the base of my door. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. They weren't just pleading, they were angry, desperate. I froze, unable to look away as the shadows pressed against my door. The whispers turned to a low, guttural hum, and I stumbled back, slamming into the wall. The hum stopped as abruptly as it had started. When I dared to look through the peephole again, the hallway was empty. The red glow was gone, and the door to the vacant unit was closed. I didn't sleep that night. The first rays of dawn found me packing my belongings in a frenzied rush. I didn't care about the lease or the money I'd lose. I just needed to leave. I had always loved the quiet of my neighborhood. The streets were lined with old trees that rustled gently in the wind, and the houses stood in orderly rows, each with a neatly kept lawn. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other from their driveways and left porch lights on as a sign of welcome. My neighbor's house was no different, or at least it hadn't been until a few weeks ago. The house itself was unremarkable. A simple two-story with faded shutters and a perpetually overgrown hedge. I hadn't interacted much with the person who lived there, a reclusive man who kept to himself, but I hadn't thought much of it. People valued their privacy, and I respected that. Then the oddities began. It started with small things. The faint hum of machinery late at night, lights flickering on and off at strange hours. Once I noticed a delivery truck pulling into their driveway around midnight, staying for only a few minutes before disappearing into the darkness. At first, I dismissed it as the quirks of someone with a peculiar schedule, but as the days passed, the activity grew stranger. Vehicles I didn't recognize began arriving at odd times, their drivers always hurried and cautious. They rarely stayed long, and I never caught more than a glimpse of their faces. My curiosity grew with each passing day, but I told myself it wasn't my business. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The noises were the first thing that truly unnerved me. At night, when the rest of the neighborhood was silent, faint thuds and muffled bangs would emanate from the house. It wasn't consistent. Sometimes it would be a single sound, like something heavy being dropped, and other times it was a rhythmic tapping, almost mechanical. One evening, as I sat reading by my window, I noticed movement in the driveway. A black car with tinted windows pulled up, and a man in a dark jacket stepped out, carrying a small locked case. He didn't knock or ring the bell. Instead, the door opened almost immediately, and he disappeared inside. The car's engine idled for a few minutes before shutting off. I watched, my curiosity piqued, but I couldn't bring myself to look for too long. There was something about the way the man had moved, deliberate and efficient, as if he didn't want to be seen. I felt a chill run down my spine. The next morning, I noticed something else, a set of tire tracks leading away from the driveway, as though the car had sped off in a hurry. The house itself looked normal, but the air around it felt off. I found myself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone staring back. My unease grew as the days went on. I couldn't help but watch the house, my curiosity warring with a growing sense of dread. The comings and goings continued, always at strange hours, always with an air of secrecy. Once I thought I saw someone carrying a large, wrapped object from the trunk of a car into the house. I couldn't tell what it was, but the shape was oddly human. I decided to ask a few casual questions when I ran into the neighbor on the sidewalk one afternoon. It was a brief encounter, but it left me rattled. His answers were curt, his tone polite but cold. His gaze lingered a little too long, as if assessing me, and when I mentioned the late-night activity, his expression darkened. "I'd suggest you mind your own business," he said, his voice low and even. It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but the underlying implication was clear. The next morning, I found a note tucked under my front door. It was a single sheet of paper, blank except for 3 words scrawled in bold, uneven letters. "Stay outside." My stomach dropped. I glanced toward the neighbor's house, but the windows were shuttered, revealing nothing. I couldn't let it go. The warning note only fueled my curiosity, and the sense of mystery surrounding the house was too much to ignore. When I saw my neighbor leave late one evening, I knew it was my chance. He drove off in his usual black sedan, and I waited until the taillights disappeared down the street before making my move. The night was cool and quiet, the kind of stillness that amplifies every sound. My heart pounded as I approached the house, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the pavement. The front door was locked, as I'd expected, but I found an open window around the side. The screen slid off easily, and I hoisted myself inside, landing awkwardly in what appeared to be a sparsely furnished living room. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint metallic smell I couldn't place. My eyes adjusted to the dim light as I moved cautiously through the house. The furniture was minimal, and the walls were bare, as if the house was barely lived in. But it was the basement door that caught my attention. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of light glowing faintly from the crack. I descended the stairs, my pulse racing with each step. The basement was cluttered with strange items. Locked metal boxes stacked haphazardly, loose papers strewn across a table, and what looked like surveillance equipment. The papers were filled with diagrams and handwritten notes, but the language was unfamiliar, the symbols indecipherable. In the corner, a tarp-covered object loomed, its shape unmistakably that of a large, human-sized figure. I moved closer, my breath hitching as I reached for the edge of the tarp. Before I could pull it back, I heard the sound of a car door slamming outside. My neighbor had returned. The sound of the car door slamming froze me in place. My breath hitched as I glanced toward the basement stairs, realizing with dawning horror that I had no way out but the way I had come in. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out the muffled sounds of footsteps approaching the house. I moved quickly, scanning the basement for a hiding spot. The shadows were deep, but the clutter offered little cover. My eyes darted to the tarp-covered object in the corner. The thought of hiding near it sent a shiver down my spine, but I didn't have time to think. I slipped behind a stack of metal boxes, crouching low and trying to steady my breathing. The front door opened, the creak of its hinges piercing the silence. Heavy footsteps echoed above me, deliberate and unhurried. My neighbor was inside, moving through the house. Each step seemed louder than the last, as if amplified by the oppressive stillness of the basement. I dared not move, barely even breathing, as the footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs. They paused. My heart sank as I heard the telltale creak of the first step. He was coming down. Each step seemed to drag out for an eternity, the sound of his weight on the wooden stairs grating against my nerves. I pressed myself closer to the metal boxes, praying the shadows would be enough to conceal me. From my vantage point, I could see his figure descending, a tall, broad shape, his silhouette lit faintly by the basement's dim light. He stopped near the table, shuffling through the papers I'd disturbed. The crinkling sound seemed deafening. He muttered something under his breath, words I couldn't make out, but that carried an unmistakable tone of frustration. I held my breath, willing myself to disappear. Then, as abruptly as he'd entered, he turned and climbed back up the stairs. The basement door slammed shut, and I was plunged into silence. I waited for what felt like hours before daring to move. The house above was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he might still be there, waiting. My legs ached from crouching, but fear kept me rooted in place. Eventually, the sound of a car starting broke the stillness, followed by the low rumble of the engine fading into the distance. Cautiously, I crept out from behind the boxes. The basement was unchanged, but the air felt heavier, as if it had absorbed the tension of the encounter. I considered fleeing immediately, but found myself drawn to the papers on the table. Most of the documents were incomprehensible, scribbles of symbols and diagrams that looked almost mathematical. One, however, caught my eye. It was a crude map, with a series of lines and arrows leading to an X, marked with the same symbol I'd seen etched faintly into one of the metal boxes. Before I could investigate further, a faint sound reached me, the slow creak of floorboards above. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone after all. I bolted for the stairs, my feet barely touching the ground as I raced up and out of the house. I didn't stop running until I was back in the safety of my own home, the door locked and bolted behind me. My chest heaved as I sank to the floor, trembling. Morning brought a tentative sense of relief. The sun filtered through my windows, dispelling some of the terror that had gripped me the night before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The neighbor's house loomed in my thoughts, its secrets gnawing at me. I couldn't resist checking it out again. From the safety of my living room window, I watched for any sign of movement. Hours passed, but the house remained still. The car was gone, and no lights flickered inside. It looked abandoned. By afternoon, my curiosity got the better of me. I ventured outside, crossing the street cautiously. The front door was locked as I'd expected, but the windows, so many of them, were wide open, curtains fluttering in the breeze. It was as though the house itself had been emptied overnight. Inside, the scene was even stranger. The basement was completely cleared out. The metal boxes, the papers, even the tarp-covered object, all gone. The air was stale and heavy, but the unsettling metallic scent was gone. It was as though the house had been wiped clean of any trace of its former occupant. The office at night was a different place. The hum of computers and the muted buzz of fluorescent lights were the only sounds breaking the oppressive stillness. By day, the building was alive with chatter and the rhythm of ringing phones. Now, it was a hollow shell. I had stayed late to finish a project, long after the rest of my coworkers had left. The deadline loomed, and I told myself it was worth a few hours of discomfort. The clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight as I finally saved my work and powered down my computer. Grabbing my bag, I headed toward the main entrance, eager to escape the eerie quiet. That's when I noticed something was wrong. The double glass doors that usually led to freedom were locked, their metallic handles cold and unyielding under my grip. I frowned, trying my badge on the scanner, but the reader beeped red. I tried calling security, but the line rang endlessly. My chest tightened as I realized I hadn't seen anyone in hours, not even the janitorial staff. The silence around me felt heavier now, the shadows longer. I told myself not to panic and began searching for another exit. The first sign was a noise, soft and distant, but distinct enough to cut through the stillness. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere down the hall. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It had to be the security guard making rounds, I thought. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. "Hello?" My voice sounded small in the empty space. No response came, only the faint creak of a door opening and then closing, far too far away to be comforting. I picked up my pace, heading toward the emergency exits. When I reached the door, my stomach dropped. A thick chain was wrapped tightly around the handles, secured with a heavy padlock. I tugged at it, but it didn't budge. That's when I saw it, or thought I did. Out of the corner of my eye, down a darkened hallway, there was movement. Just a flicker, barely more than a shadow. When I turned to look, the hallway was empty. My heart raced, and I told myself I was imagining things. But as I moved, the sound of footsteps seemed to follow, growing louder with every turn. I began to notice the signs, small, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. In the break room, a chair was pulled out from the table, as though someone had just been sitting there. A coffee cup, half filled and still steaming, sat on the counter. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. It hadn't been there earlier. I was certain of that. The air felt charged, heavy with an unseen presence. Every creak of the floor, every faint hum of the ventilation system seemed amplified. My skin prickled with the sense that I wasn't alone. Turning a corner, I caught a glimpse of something in a mirrored surface, a fleeting shadow, just behind me. Whipping around, I found nothing but empty corridors. The silence became suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of shuffling footsteps. I ducked into an office and locked the door, my heart pounding. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as though unseen eyes were following my every move. I peeked through the blinds, scanning the hallway outside. It was empty, but the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though waiting for me to step back out. I couldn't stay in that office. The walls felt like they were closing in. Summoning my courage, I slipped out and made a beeline for the main entrance again. If I couldn't get through the emergency exits, maybe I'd missed something at the front. The office felt alive now, not with people, but with a sense of movement just out of sight. As I passed the cubicles, the air grew colder, and the sound of faint laughter reached my ears. It was distant, echoing through the halls, but unmistakable. When I reached the main entrance, I nearly cried with relief. One of the side doors had been left ajar, the faint glow of the streetlights beyond spilling into the building. I didn't question my luck. I ran for it, ignoring the sound of footsteps closing in behind me. Bursting into the cool night air, I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block. My lungs burned, and my heart felt like it would burst. Glancing back, I saw nothing, no sign of anyone following. I allowed myself a shaky breath of relief and started toward home, telling myself it was over. But it wasn't. The streets were eerily quiet as I made my way home, my breath still uneven from the sprint. The relief of escaping the building was fleeting. Every shadow seemed to loom larger, every faint noise amplified by the stillness of the night. I glanced over my shoulder, the instinct sudden and inexplicable. That's when I saw it, a figure, distant but unmistakable, standing under a street lamp half a block away. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. My pulse quickened as I turned back around and quickened my pace. I told myself it was just a random passerby, someone walking late like me. But when I reached the next intersection and risked another glance, the figure was still there, closer now. My stomach twisted. Whoever they were following me. Panic surged through me as I picked up the pace, my footsteps echoing loudly against the pavement. The figure's pace quickened too, their shadow stretching across the street under the dim glow of the streetlights. I turned a corner abruptly, hoping to lose them, but the sound of their footsteps followed, steady and deliberate. The chase was relentless. I darted across intersections, weaving through alleys and side streets, but the figure never faltered. Their footsteps were heavy, growing louder with each passing second. I could hear their breathing now, ragged and strained, as though the effort was affecting them, but not slowing them down. My lungs burned, and my legs ached as I pushed myself harder. I passed shuttered storefronts and empty bus stops, the streets barren save for me and my pursuer. The city, normally comforting in its anonymity, felt vast and desolate, offering no place to hide. At one point, I spotted an alley and ducked into it, pressing myself against the cold brick wall. My heart thundered in my chest as I listened for their approach. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. I held it, straining to hear where they were. The silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating. Then, out of the darkness, a shadow moved. The figure stepped into the alley, their head turning slowly as if searching for me. I didn't wait. I bolted, their footsteps immediately resuming behind me, closer than ever. My apartment building was in sight, its familiar shape a beacon of safety in the otherwise hostile night. I forced my legs to move faster, ignoring the screaming protest of my muscles. The figure was close now, so close I could hear the scrape of their shoes against the pavement. I reached the front door and fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped them. The footsteps slowed, and I could feel the figure's presence behind me, oppressive and heavy. Finally, I managed to shove the key into the lock and threw the door open, slamming it shut behind me. I locked the deadbolt and stumbled back, my chest heaving. Through the peephole, I could see the figure standing on the other side. Their face was obscured by shadows, but their posture was unnervingly still. They didn't try the handle or knock. They simply stood there, watching. Minutes passed, then what felt like hours. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I stood frozen, my back pressed against the wall, waiting for them to do something. Finally, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as silently as they had appeared. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the building, every distant noise made my heart race. I double-checked the locks on my windows and door, even moving a chair in front of the entrance for good measure. The silence that once felt comforting was now oppressive. The next morning, the sunlight did little to dispel the lingering fear. I opened my door cautiously, scanning the hallway for any sign of the stranger. It was empty, just as it always had been. Jogging had always been my escape. The park, with its winding trails and serene atmosphere, felt like my haven, a place where I could leave the world behind and focus on the rhythm of my steps. I had my usual route, a well-trodden loop that circled the open fields and skirted the edges of the forest. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt an inexplicable urge to explore. The path I chose was narrower than the main trail, overgrown with wild grass and framed by trees whose branches twisted together like skeletal fingers. It was the kind of trail I'd passed dozens of times but never ventured down. Curiosity got the better of me. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The distant laughter of children playing and the faint hum of traffic faded away, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. I told myself the isolation was refreshing, but a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that I'd wandered too far. After what felt like miles, I stumbled upon a clearing. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, just a patch of earth surrounded by towering oaks. But as I stepped closer, I noticed strange details. Candles were placed in a rough circle, their flames flickering against the encroaching darkness. Symbols had been etched into the dirt, intricate patterns that didn't resemble anything I'd seen before. Then I saw them, figures moving within the circle, their shadows long and distorted in the dim light. My breath caught as I realized I wasn't alone. I crouched low, slipping behind a tree at the edge of the clearing. My pulse quickened as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. There were 6, maybe 7 people, all dressed in dark clothing that blended into the twilight. They moved with purpose, their actions synchronized as though they were following some unseen conductor. One of them knelt near the center of the circle, carefully arranging items I couldn't quite make out. Another held a piece of paper, their voice low and rhythmic as they read from it. The others stood in a loose formation, their heads bowed, murmuring in unison. The words didn't sound like any language I recognized, their cadence unsettling. As my eyes adjusted, more details came into focus. The symbols on the ground weren't random, they formed a pattern, spiraling inward toward the center of the circle. Nearby, I spotted a small wooden box, its lid slightly ajar. Inside were objects I couldn't identify, small vials, feathers, and what looked disturbingly like bone fragments. My stomach churned. This wasn't some harmless gathering. It felt deliberate, calculated, dangerous. I told myself to leave, to turn around and run, but something kept me rooted in place, a morbid curiosity holding me captive. A sharp crack shattered the silence. My foot had snapped a twig beneath me. The murmuring stopped. Every head turned toward my hiding spot. For a moment, the clearing was deathly silent, the only sound the frantic pounding of my heart. "Who's there?" A voice called out, sharp and commanding. It was deep, with a tone that carried authority and menace. My breath caught as one of the figures stepped forward, a tall silhouette framed by the flickering candlelight. I tried to shrink further into the shadows, my back pressed against the rough bark of the tree. But it was too late. One of them pointed in my direction, their voice urgent. "There, in the trees!" Panic surged through me. I bolted, crashing through the underbrush without looking back. Shouts erupted behind me, followed by the sound of footsteps giving chase. They weren't just calling out, they were yelling instructions, coordinating their pursuit. The forest, so serene moments ago, now felt like a maze of shadows and noise. Branches clawed at my arms and face as I ran, the uneven ground threatening to trip me with every step. The candlelight faded behind me, but the sound of their pursuit didn't. The park's trails twisted and turned, but I ran blindly, guided only by the primal urge to escape. My breaths came in sharp, ragged gasps, and my legs burned with the effort. The shouts behind me grew louder, their voices filled with a mix of anger and urgency. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. The figures were closer than I'd thought, their dark shapes darting between the trees like predators closing in on their prey. One of them carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating the path ahead. I veered off the trail, plunging into the thicker woods where the trees grew closer together. The ground was uneven here, littered with roots and fallen branches that threatened to trip me. The flashlight's beam flickered through the gaps in the trees, searching, hunting. "Stop running!" one of them yelled, their voice slicing through the night. I didn't stop. The fear driving me was stronger than the ache in my lungs or the sting of the scratches on my arms. I couldn't let them catch me. I didn't want to know what would happen if they did. The path ahead opened up slightly, and I spotted a familiar landmark. An old wooden bridge that spanned a narrow creek. Beyond it, the park's main trail led toward the populated areas. If I could make it there, I might have a chance. The old wooden bridge loomed ahead, its planks weathered and creaking underfoot. I sprinted toward it, the sound of my pursuers growing louder behind me. My heart felt like it would explode, each beat pounding in my ears as I reached the bridge and bolted across. The wood groaned beneath my weight, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it might give way. I didn't slow down, leaping over a missing plank and nearly losing my balance as I landed on the far side. The voices behind me were clearer now, their urgency cutting through the night. "Keep going! Don't let them get away!" I veered off the trail again, plunging into a dense thicket. Branches snagged my clothes and scraped my skin, but I didn't care. I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and the clearing. The undergrowth provided some cover, but it also slowed me down. I could hear their footsteps crashing through the woods, relentless and unyielding. Suddenly, I stumbled into another clearing. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't just any part of the park. It was another ritual site. Extinguished candles sat in a perfect circle, their wax pooling into the dirt. Symbols similar to the ones I'd seen earlier were carved into the surrounding trees, their lines stark and jagged in the moonlight. The air felt thick here, oppressive, as though it carried the weight of something unseen. I didn't linger. Whatever this place was, I wanted no part of it. I pushed forward, the sounds of my pursuers spurring me on. The voices behind me grew louder. They were close, too close. I ducked behind a thick tree, pressing my body against the rough bark as I tried to catch my breath. My chest heaved and I covered my mouth with my hand, willing myself to stay silent. A flashlight beam swept through the trees, cutting dangerously close to my hiding spot. I held my breath, my muscles tensed and ready to run. The light moved past, but the figures were close now, so close I could hear the rustle of their clothes and the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. "Check over there," one of them said, their voice low but sharp. I heard footsteps approaching, deliberate and unhurried. My stomach twisted with fear as I realized they were heading straight for me. I crouched lower, my fingers digging into the dirt as I prepared to bolt. The flashlight beam returned, illuminating the ground just feet away. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then, as if by some miracle, the footsteps veered away. The beam of light swung in the opposite direction, and the voices began to fade. I didn't wait to see if they'd return. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I broke into a run, heading for the edge of the park. The trees began to thin, and the faint glow of streetlights in the distance filled me with a flicker of hope. My legs burned with the effort, but I pushed on, driven by the knowledge that safety was within reach. Behind me, the shouts had faded, replaced by an eerie silence. It was almost worse than the sound of their pursuit. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see one of them emerge from the shadows, but the woods remained still. Finally, I stumbled onto the main trail. A few joggers and late-night dog walkers were scattered along the path, their presence grounding me in reality. I slowed to a stop, doubling over as I struggled to catch my breath. My heart raced, and my entire body trembled, but I was safe, for now. The group hadn't followed me out of the woods. Whether they'd given up or chosen not to venture into the populated area, I didn't know. All I cared about was putting as much distance as possible between myself and that clearing.